Welcome everyone. For those who are just tuning in the last segment, Wilgrow launched a technology platform for incubators called Vitals. If you missed it, the recording will be up on the Unconvention dashboard soon. We're now going to be discussing why gender matters in solving for climate change. And we're lucky to have some of the most experienced minds in this space as a part of this conversation. It has been very thoughtfully curated and will be moderated by Ulka Kelkar, who is the director of the climate program at the World Resources Institute India. So without further ado, over to you, Ulka.
Thank you so much, Maithili, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're very excited about this panel today. I'll start with a few small opening remarks and then hand over to each of the panelists turn by turn. So the topic of this panel is about gender, why it's important in solving for climate change. And I wanted to start by making 3 points. One, this researcher, Seema Arola Johnson, talks about virtue and vulnerability when it comes to gender in the context of climate change. And what she tries to convey is that those who are the least contributors to emissions causing climate change are the ones who are most at risk, the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And you could slice this in 2 ways. You could compare developing countries with developed countries, and you could compare women and men, making women in developing countries perhaps the most vulnerable, even though they're the least contributors. So you could think of it as a double whammy when it comes to climate change. But of course, you could also argue that it's much more nuanced than that. And that is something that our first panelist, Neha Pahuja, will be speaking about. How are women affected by climate change and why it's important to bring this into consideration when we talk about solutions to climate change. The second issue is one of diagnosing problems in a way that is not gender blind or gender neutral. And why does this matter? For example, when we look at issues of cyclone or disaster risks increasing due to climate change, and we try to figure out what's the way to solve this problem, often the kinds of cyclone shelters or the kinds of disaster resilient housing that's provided is something that is done where the problem is addressed without involving women, the affected communities. And what results is sometimes cyclone shelters, which are just one basic box, which don't have segregation for the different sexes, which don't have separate toilets, and perhaps sometimes even cyclone resistant houses, which don't have separate kitchens. So sometimes when you look at a problem as a completely technocratic issue without really looking at how people live or live their lives, you can lead to a wrong problem diagnosis. And that's the kind of thing that Stephanie Finnegan will be talking about, why it's important to bring gender into problem solving when it comes to climate change. And third is the issue of bringing a gender lens into specific solutions, and solutions which are provided by women themselves, by women-led businesses themselves. I wanted to give here 3 examples from my country, which is India. First, when we introduced the kinds of cropping practices or varieties or interventions that are required in agriculture, we often speak only to male farmers. And the resulting solution is things like high-yielding varieties of crops. But if you look at the little sort of invisible operations of agriculture, weeding, for example, that is done by women. And often we don't talk to the women who will be making sure that the kind of solution that we are providing will be effective, making sure that they have access to training, and making sure that their work burden doesn't increase. The metrics that we apply to successful solutions are also very important. Vishal Narayan has a piece of work from the foothills of the Shivalik Mountains in India, where he looks at when village taps were introduced, and everybody thought that that solves the problem of women's work burden because water is coming closer to the village rather than having to go to a river or the water body to collect water. Eventually, it was found that women's work burden actually increased because men, instead of going down to the river to bathe or to wash their capital, expected women to now fetch the water into the home. So that's another issue. And the third, sort of very recent example from the work of Bhargavi Rao from one of the largest solar parks in South India, in Chamrajnagar, found that when farmers were selling their land for a solar park, all these deals were made in liquor shops by men. The women were not even consulted. And the result was that when you switch from an agricultural family to a family which has sold its land for a solar park, you may get a bit of money, but then you may need to migrate for an alternative livelihood and break the social networks that you've depended on. This changes a lot of things. So that's the kind of thing that Richenda will be bringing and highlighting to our attention, why it's important to make women part of the solution to addressing climate change. So with that background, let me start by requesting Neha to say a few words about herself and about her work and to make her opening remarks, please. Neha, could you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, Ulka. So, as you mentioned, I work with Steady, and for last 12 to 13 years, I've been focusing on climate policy issues, looking at international negotiations and domestic developmental activities within the climate domain, and that has been large part of my work. So, I'll be just touching upon why the issue of climate change is really important, because we are already seeing that climate is changing, and we are witnessing that there is increase in number of extreme event conditions such as drought, storms, floods, etc., which is altering the economies and the way we grow and the economic development of all countries. However, it is also important to highlight, which Ulka also touched upon, that everyone will be affected, but these changes would be felt differently and unequally. So there would be adverse impacts on the developing countries, and within developing countries there are vulnerable people, and most vulnerable perhaps is poor women. But before we start, then what do how it is important to also understand how we understand vulnerability. Vulnerability can be determined by a community's or individuals' ability to adapt or cope to climate change. And when I say that women would be the most vulnerable in poor countries, it is because of cultural norms and unequitable distribution of resources and the role they have and power. They basically are more vulnerable in developing countries than other countries. However, despite the growing recognition of such differential vulnerabilities, women still have um, less economic and political legal clout, in the sense that they don't have a say per se when it comes to policy making or designing of certain infrastructure. However, they are still powerful agents of change, and they continue to make increasing and significant contributions when we talk about sustainable development or environmental policies. And given that everybody in the panel is a woman, I would say that that emphasizes that women plays an important role already. However, there is need that we need to identify this and mainstream it. Uh, and 2015 marked an important milestone as far as climate policy. Like internationally, we agreed on Paris Agreement. It also marked an important year for sustainable development policy, since we agreed on sustainable development goals. So now that we are in the implementation phase, it is important that we have women's participation in policy making and in some of the actions which would be undertaken. So in order to conceive important actions, what we thought, and one point that I want to make, that when we are talking about women, I mean, there is growing recognition, but we talk about, there is more literature or more research done on adaptation policy when we're talking about women in poor areas and villages, how they will cope to disasters, how will they will cope to extreme events. But we don't see, there is glaring gap between how the relationship is with designing of mitigation opportunities. And most of the mitigation opportunities would come from, because women are drawing behavioral changes in the family, whether or not they have a decision making power in the community, but within the family, the kind of choices, the kind of resource conservation that happens is driven by how a woman perceives things. So I think it is relevant to have women also included in terms of designing of mitigation policy. That would be really important. And then what needs to be done? Quickly, I will just throw some questions here. Maybe it would be important to identify the forms of exclusion, like where are they excluded, and then try to identify opportunities where there can be parity of opportunity, parity of participation while designing the reform, so that both men and women have equal opportunity. And perhaps it has to be supplemented with identification of efforts that would be required to build the capabilities of women as well as men in a similar place, so that both of them are on equal platform to voice their opinion while devising a policy or an action. And just to highlight the self-help groups in case of microfinance, where women played an important role, created a stir globally, like internationally. And similar things have been tried when we talk of adaptation programs also, through small scale pilots of community based adaptation, which are largely driven by self help groups and women leaders in small communities, which are trying to make their own climate sensitive action plans, micro planning, and things like that. So that kind of a thing can also be, taken up in case of mitigation and other actions. And I'm definitely sure not even villages and only relevant to adaptation, but it can be scaled up in very large number of enterprises. I'm sure our next panelist would be talking about the same. Over to you, Urka.
Thank you so much, Neha. You very rightly pointed out the disproportionate impacts and the need for both formal as well as informal opportunities and forums and the recognition of that. So thank you very much. That was very well put. Let me now turn to Stephanie. Stephanie Finnegan works with Value for Women. Could you please say a little bit about yourself, your organization, and make your opening remarks in this panel? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ulka, and really great to be here with everybody today. So I'm Stephanie Finnegan. I'm the Director of Programs at Value for Women. And Value for Women is a global advisory firm that really brings together our team of business experts and gender specialists to work with our partners developing what we call a business-first approach to gender inclusion. So what we mean by that is that we really try to focus on incorporating gender into businesses where they are, meeting businesses where they are in their gender journey, as well as helping businesses see how gender can be seamlessly incorporated into their day-to-day operations as well as their larger strategy, rather than having gender sort of sit on the outside of a business. So oftentimes gender can be pushed, as a nice to have, or someday we'll get to it. And we really try and show businesses how it is that you can actually start right away by incorporating gender into your work. And by doing so, you're going to have both social and business impacts that will be beneficial for you. So most of our partners are impact investors. We work with DFIs, we work with SGBs and entrepreneurs. And for the sake of the conversation today, while we as an organization consider ourselves sector agnostic, we do a lot of work in the climate space as well as in the clean energy space. So for the sake of today's conversation, that's where I'll focus. Most of our work in that area is really with SGBs. What we understand is that SGBs, climate is a complete crisis, and SGBs are really drivers of solutions to that, to addressing the climate crisis that we're all facing. And what we know at Value for Women is that gender and climate are very much interlinked. And I think many people on this call agree with that, and the data continues to show how much climate change is impacting women and how much the opportunity there is for women to be real drivers of solutions to addressing the climate crisis. What we do at Value for Women is try and marry all those pieces together. So you have the climate crisis, you have working with SGBs who are working to address the crisis, and then you also have women playing a role. And what we really do is to try and support the SGBs who we work with to help them see where it is that women can be incorporated both within their own businesses as well as externally when we're thinking about their customers and their end users. And how is it that we can both help them understand how it is that gender and climate are linked, and then really unpack those linkages and help them see what are the direct solutions that they can apply, that they can actually incorporate women into business with that end game in mind of trying to drive solutions for both the business and climate at large. So for us, we know gender inclusion is a real essential piece to all of that. What we also understand is that SGBs are very busy, very overwhelmed. They're trying to solve some tremendous problems in this sector in particular. And what we really believe is that women can be an essential piece of that, but we also understand SGBs might not inherently understand how to do that, might not inherently know how it is that they can incorporate gender into their operations. And so that's our job, is to show them the how. And we focus very much, as you said, Ulka, at the start, on really kind of diagnosing diagnosing what the problems are and then developing solutions, we really focus on that with a gender lens. So what are the problems that a business is facing, whether it's sales, marketing, growth, what are the business challenges? And then how can we help apply a gender lens to that can bring both business solution as well as that with a gender impact. So I'll pause there. I'll go into more specific examples during my talk, but that's—
Thank you. That's really refreshing to hear, Stephanie, because often when we work with policymakers, say with city officials, or even with the corporate sector, we often get this sense that climate is not something at the top of their agenda, right? And gender is also not something at the top of anyone's agenda. So it's really refreshing to hear how you've mainstreamed that and made it a central part of all the work that you do. So we'd love to hear more about it as we come around again. So may I now turn to Richenda Van Leeuwen, and Richenda works with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. Over to you. We'd love to hear a little bit more about your work.
Thank you very much, Ulka, and it's great to hear the other panelists, because I think I'm going to build on what's already been said in terms of setting the stage. But just to introduce myself, Richenda Van Leeuwen, I'm the Executive Director of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. We are a global membership organization that really helps to support and strengthen the entrepreneurship ecosystem in emerging markets, particularly working with intermediaries like business development, capacity building providers, impact investors, researchers, and others, including Value for Women, including Vilgrow, as part of our membership. And we've been working in India for over 9 years and globally for 11 years in this journey. I think the points that I really want to make are more around just some of the systemic challenges that women entrepreneurs are still facing, both in relation to climate action, but also just more generally, and particularly we have at Andy, we've been doing a lot of research around some of the challenges that we still see women facing as entrepreneurs, particularly in the small business sector. And we need to recognize that these challenges exist. And it was great to hear from Stephanie just about some of the work that they do, which is on the solution side, but really looking at the fact that, first of all, that there are fewer women entrepreneurs in many countries, like in India, in the small business sector. Those that are there tend to have had to start their business and operate it for longer than men-led enterprises before they can access finance. If they go through an acceleration program, Andy's research, global research has found that actually male entrepreneurs come out ahead of women entrepreneurs through acceleration programs. And that's not because the women entrepreneurs are not as good as the men at running the business. It's really because there's still systemic biases in the system that prevent the women from being able to get the support that they need. And then we also find that, yes, while debt is available to women-led enterprises, equity is still a challenge, particularly growth equity for women-led enterprises. And so just to say that even quite apart from how we're talking about climate action, we do see that there are some systemic issues and challenges that we need to recognize. And therefore we need data. And we really need to look at the data and the benchmarking of how we're doing in this sector. What are the numbers of women entrepreneurs who are being put through acceleration programs? How are we addressing the level of financing? How are we actually measuring whether women entrepreneurs are succeeding? So that we can also then, as an ecosystem, really develop the systems to help manage and support women entrepreneurs throughout that whole development process. Coming to climate action specifically, I spent the last 15 years in the renewable energy industry and started out as one of 3 women investors at a lot of global conferences. So I have seen some movement, but even today in India, in in rooftop solar companies, actually, in terms of just the number of women represented as employees, it's only 11% compared to 32% globally. So that's just in terms of the employment, let alone in terms of women leading the enterprises. Now, you may say that that doesn't matter, you know, it's taking time, it's a generational issue. I think the person who said it best is actually Hiro Mizumi, who is the UN Special Envoy for innovative finance and sustainable investment. And he said that inequity is a systemic risk and that companies that lack gender diversity are carrying inherent risk in their businesses. So rather than saying, why should we be including women and why should we be supporting women, I think that the question should be turned around and say, if you are not including women, if you are not supporting women as part of the solution for climate action, whether it's on mitigation, whether it's on adaptation, then you actually are carrying systemic risk in your business. So we've already heard a little bit about the need to design shelters, cyclone shelters, you know, with women in mind. If you have women in your leadership team, if you have women that are leading the business, then you can incorporate those design elements much more seamlessly than if you were not really looking there. So I will just conclude with that and then can carry on some additional remarks further in the discussion. So thank you, Ulka.
Thank you so much, Richenda, for highlighting those systemic issues. And that's really something that we will come back to later in this panel discussion to discuss how we can support, how the entire ecosystem can support women-led women entrepreneurs better. But let me now turn back to Neha. And Neha, in your opening remarks, you very eloquently spoke about the disproportionate impacts of potentially of climate change. And now we are seeing those disproportionate impacts manifested in the COVID pandemic, this crisis that we have all just gone through. I mean, one of the shocking statistics is around jobs, that the kinds of job losses that have happened have affected women more, and particularly those in the informal sector. And the job gains that have been made as the economies recover have also benefited men more rather than women. And I read this rather moving article which said that one of the reasons is that women actually still feel guilt around having to compromise on the work-life balance. And they will rather take a pay cut than sacrifice their caregiving roles at home. So this is often something very personal for all of us. But the question that I want to ask you about is, as we speak about making our economies more resilient to future crises, including climate change, how do you think these disproportionate impacts should be addressed? How can we make sure that the benefits of new green jobs, for example, can accrue more to women? So that's a very broad question. You can choose to focus on a specific part of it, but using the pandemic in some sense as a kind of a dress rehearsal for this crisis that is looming ahead for us. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Ulka. Yes, I think it was a broad question and can be addressed in several ways. But I think if we kind of break the stereotyped gendered roles that we already have for women and recognize women as key stakeholders who are claimants of low carbon technology, like if somebody is claimant of low carbon technology, and then there would be more motivation to provide access to those technologies. As Richenda earlier mentioned, in case of renewable energy technologies, there are less entrepreneurs in female entrepreneurs, or there are less jobs for females. So perhaps if we identify them as the key claimants or beneficiaries of a low carbon society, it was they would definitely get the access. So access is an issue. Therefore, the recognition of them having the ability, both technical, soft skills, because generally women are identified for their soft skills rather than their technical abilities. So that stereotype have to be breaked. There has to be something where we sort of break from the stereotype. Maybe we have larger stakeholder development activities which focus on breaking this kind of stereotypes. I think the session today and other sessions where women have key voice and they're voicing these things would do good for this cause. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Neha. That's really very insightful. Let me just turn to Stephanie now. And, there is this book by Carolina Criado Perez called Invisible Women. And she gives a number of examples of gender blind design of products and services, right? I think when the pandemic first started, there was a shortage of PPE that fit women doctors and nurses, right? It was all designed for large men. Another sort of example that typically comes up is designing safe public transport for women. In your experience, when there are women-led small businesses, do you find that that translates into better products and services that are not gender blind? Do you have any examples or experiences to share on that?
Definitely, yeah. Those are great examples that you just shared, and I think there's more and more coming out around sort of COVID, where who have had ability to sort of have the vaccines tested on them, all of those things. There's lots of questions coming up about where women are being considered. When we work with businesses, what we have certainly found is that the more that women are involved in the decision making at a business, the more likely it is that the products and services will be designed with women in mind. It seems very logical to think about it, but it's also kind of amazing that for a very long time it just didn't seem obvious, right? And so we've seen everything from, if women are, whether or not they're actually, it's a women-led business or women-founded business, or a business where women are just more heavily incorporated into the employment of the organization. We've seen, HR policies that can be influenced heavily with women involved and keeping women in mind. We've seen internal practices. We've seen sales and marketing that is sometimes designed without women in mind, there can be pivoted towards making sure that women are being reached, women customers are being reached, and that sales strategies are being carried out in a way that are inclusive to women. And that product design obviously is a big one. I think there's been many examples that we've read and know about where businesses will design products that were meant for women, but didn't actually test the product on women. So there's cases of cook stoves, for example, that were designed with the intention that women would use them, but they were designed, they were much too heavy, much too bulky for women, or they were too large for the typical kitchens. And if you had women in that product design process, likely somebody would have raised their hand and said, this product might not fit for the target customer that we're looking for. Let's ask our actual end users rather than make assumptions. I think the one specific example I can give very briefly around this is in an area that doesn't often get thought of, which is around the sales and marketing side of things. So if you look outward as a business, we have worked with a business, it was an SGB in India that sold solar home products, solar products for household use. The business had both women and men in their direct sales force. And they noticed that women were not performing as well as men. And so we did a gender analysis and unpacked why that might be. And there was a whole litany of challenges that women face that their male peers didn't, around security, mobility, transportation. You mentioned that was one of the issues, as well as access to capital to purchase demo kits to actually use during sales. And so a lot of the women agents just simply did not have that capital that their male peers did. So we ran a pilot with the business, and the business actually provided that capital to women agents to try to really level the playing field. And when we did that, we saw women agents not only outperformed male peers when it came to direct sales, but did so, they were able to sell as much or more than their male peers in the same amount or less time. So they were more efficient and better at sales during the pilots that we ran. And all that was needed was just an opportunity to really level that playing field for them, which is what the business was able to provide. So in doing that, both social and business impacts were seen by the business, and they've since been able to sort of take that and scale that effort up because it was so impactful on both levels for them.
Thank you. That's a really nice example. It just goes to show that there are opportunities for innovative new business models, new approaches, untapped markets. It's just a matter of sort of recognizing them and then designing accordingly. So thank you very much for sharing that example. Let me turn to Richenda. Richenda, you spoke initially about the systemic challenges. Would you like to elaborate a little bit more on the challenges that women entrepreneurs face and how we as an ecosystem can support small and growing businesses in particular? Some of the examples that you gave when you spoke earlier reminded me very much of fieldwork which I had done in rural Maharashtra, where animal husbandry was promoted as a way of diversifying incomes for agricultural families. And when we spoke to women, the entire care of the cattle, from waking up in the morning, getting fodder, milking, all of that was done by the women. And when we asked, what do the men do? The men take the milk, go on their motorcycles to the nearest market, sell the milk, and keep the money. So you very rightly pointed about the issues of access, issues to market also. I think the moment a particular livelihood activity becomes commercialized is when sometimes it slips out of the hands of women and becomes captured by men. Has that been your experience? And what are the solutions? What are the approaches that you have taken to support women-led entrepreneurs? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, yes, I'm sorry to say it, but over many decades now, I've seen this again and again, and we do seem to be learning the same lessons in different sectors. So I think the work of groups like Value for Women is just extremely important, of being able to bring a toolkit, a methodology, an approach, unpack it, rather than people just saying, okay, well, we have this issue, but actually being able to use a methodology that has been shown to work and then adopt it. I would still say, though, just building on Stephanie's point in the solar sector, particularly, I think I've worked with helping to set some of the global targets around energy access, which again, is also a great way of supporting climate green friendly solutions, that are low carbon, and helping people to opt into to greener solutions rather than sort of using fossil fuel based electricity where possible. And one of the things that we've seen there as well is that if you're really focusing today, 800 million people still don't have electricity around the world. If you just look at that as a target, you can just talk about connections. The challenge, however, is that you really need to look at it from the holistic standpoint of what is the purpose of the electricity? What is it that we're really trying to achieve? Now, for a solar company, you may just say, well, we're trying to sell products into the community. But what we're really trying to do with looking at energy access is actually have that transformative whole life support and benefit. So that does mean, are the solutions that you're providing, are they actually being offered to women? Are they helping women in their own businesses? So the Selco Foundation in India, where I've been affiliated for many years, on the board of Selco company, has really been focusing on the use of targeted solar together with the entrepreneurs who are running their businesses and looking at how you can design for that solution. Now, if you're just stopping at saying, for example, in the mini grid, well, we're going to provide this mini grid into the community, and then you look at who has the most need for electricity, almost invariably, you're only going to be looking at the male entrepreneurs, because often a lot of the businesses run by women don't need so much electricity, and so that they have less demand, and so they get calculated out of the mix. So if you're really coming at this with a gender lens, then you'll be starting across the whole process of looking differently at how are you looking at monetizing your mini grid? How are you looking at who are your customers? How are you looking at what is it that you're really measuring in terms of success? And there's been some great examples of being able to do that now. And I think that the value of panels like this is really just to help get that word out that we do have approaches, we do have solutions, but we need to address it holistically, which is one of the things that Andy really is looking at as well, is how can we do this systemically so that not every business then has to sort of start again from scratch.
Thank you. Thanks. I think there's a lot there to learn from, and I'm hoping that we will get more questions from the audience as well. I'm sure there are a lot of people listening in who also have examples and experiences to share. So it'd be great to learn from their experiences as well. I wonder if at this point we can take some of the audience questions. I'd like to start, perhaps Neha, requesting you. The first question is about the issue of data. I mean, how do we become gender sensitive, or how do we stop being gender blind? It often comes down to the fact that disaggregated data is just not collected or made available in the form in which it's required. So the question that that someone from the audience has asked is adding more lens to get disaggregate data as an enterprise solution, but doing so increases the cost for small businesses. How do we balance cost and the need to do this? So Neha, in your experience, would you agree with this, or would you have any thoughts to share on whether this is something that requires going out of your way or adding to your cost?
So, while responding to this question, I would say having the data empowers you to strategize and perhaps be more responsive to the situation. So, if you have more data, you will do better. Whether you are leading an enterprise, or you are trying to make a policy or a business plan, you are going to do better if you have data. You have more hold of the situation. And whether it would add to the cost, I would suggest no, because it's the gender data is just a tick mark or a cross in that sense. I mean, we can get basic data with minimal cost, so perhaps benefits would be larger than the cost. So if we do a cost benefit analysis, the costs would be less of collecting the data, but benefits of using that information to re-strategize and to perhaps invent solutions would be larger. That's the short point of it.
Thanks. I really like that the data empowers you. Richenda, Stephanie, are there any examples that this question, sort of any thoughts that this question strikes in your mind about, have you helped any particular business through this journey of collecting disaggregated data, and did it add to their cost, or did it actually, help them design better solutions and tap new markets, possibly? Either of you. Stephanie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think what we found, a slightly different angle, but what we found oftentimes is that the businesses that we work with actually have a lot of sex disaggregated data already. And it's simply a little bit of what I said earlier. It's simply they're unclear on how to use it or what to do with it. So sort of taking that and actually turning it into practical action or solutions. So we found two things. One is sometimes a business has the data and they aren't even aware that they have it, or they have it and it's just been coded differently, or something that's a relatively simple fix. And other times they have the data, but they're just not sure of exactly how to put it to good use. And so a lot of the work, that's actually the data, we call it the low-hanging fruit. When we're walking in to work with a business, that's the first thing we do is we find out what they're collecting. In terms of data, we try and see what are easy additions to that, or easy ways that they can adjust that data so that it can really tell a story about what's happening either with their employees or their customers. And then from there, then we use that data to help us figure out where are the gaps and the holes and the opportunities for more inclusion across the business. And then we build the strategies that we develop. We really build them off of what we found in the data. So I guess the short answer to that is just, it's not always, it can feel overwhelming sometimes for a business, but sometimes businesses are sitting on a gold mine of data and information that can really help them when it comes to gender, and they just might not be aware of it yet. But taking a closer look at that data, there might be solutions right there that they just might not be aware of yet.
Yeah, and if really interesting. Yes, please.
If I can just add briefly that upstream as well, we're seeing that the business development capacity providers, the accelerators, also need to know what the tools are so they can advise the businesses. So one of the things that Andy is doing through our gender equality work, which is one of our key themes, along with climate action, is actually providing grant funding in some parts of the world, not yet currently in India, but really for looking about advancing women's empowerment through providing the intermediaries with the funding for them to begin to test tools, to begin to incorporate that gender side in terms of how they actually provide the support to the businesses. So, it shouldn't be that it's all on the business to try and figure this out. If they're going through an acceleration program, the accelerator should be the one that's giving them guidance, talking them through, the different tools that they can be using and seeing what's relevant for their context. And then the second thing is that that the investors also really need to be looking at this. And I would still say, back in the day when I first joined renewable energy, part of the challenge was that we didn't have women on investment committees. We didn't have the women who were investors. And if you're on the investment committee and you're reflecting an investor, then you're often the person who ends up sitting on the board of the company of your investee. And so if you're not having women throughout that whole pipeline, if you will, then you're liable to have less focus within the company on this. So it's also sensitizing the investment community and saying, as we are doing on ESG issues, saying that this is an absolute necessity. If you're not doing it, as I started with my comments, basically you have a systemic risk. So it's just really making it the business norm that, yes, this is something that you do.
Thank you. I think all three incredible insights, and I certainly learned a lot from something that seems like a very standard question. I think climate change, especially in research, we always start by blaming the data, but all three of you have given such interesting insights into the issue of how data is there, that can be used to empower us, and it's everyone's responsibility. So I think that's just brilliant. Perhaps we can try to tackle the second question, which may seem a little bit of a repetition of what you have said already, but it gives us a chance to maybe dig a little deeper. So the question that the participant has asked is, are there any stakeholders who are approaching this issue with a gender lens? Is there specific support for women entrepreneurs? I think we could think of this as a question that, who do we go to if we want to kind of make this journey? Would you have any particular sort of, starting steps or starting sort of go-to helpers, for them? What would you start with? And maybe we could reverse the order this time. Richenda, I don't know if you'd like to go first and try to give some advice to this participant.
Yeah, I would say, there's groups like Value for Women that are out there, and you're seeing Stephanie in action here. So, from Andy, our membership is around 300. The majority of our members, which are mostly intermediaries, are indeed focusing on some kind of gender lens engagement today. So that's the good news, that there are many stakeholders who are approaching this. Not yet enough that are specifically looking at the nexus of gender and climate action, however. So that is an area where I would say our journey is still early, and that we still need to make the case. We still need to really benchmark the data around how we can do this, whether it's in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of adaptation, and also in terms of climate justice. I think we've talked a lot, about some of the inequities that women face, and I think there's that justice piece as well, very much in there. So just to say, we welcome others to join us in this and really help to highlight and showcase. Yes, we need, as Nihal said at the beginning, women are uniquely vulnerable, but they're also uniquely capable in knowing what they need at the local level. The UN FCCC has actually shown that, in fact, by incorporating women's leadership, climate projects have better outcomes. So I think we can say the same, and just parallel that in the small business sector as well.
Great. Stephanie, would you like to add to what Richenda has already said?
Sure. I'll echo what Richenda said, which is certainly, Value for Women is a resource and an area where if businesses or organizations or folks are looking for stakeholders who are in this space, we are in this space. So I will plug us, but also to say, the Andy network is a very robust network, as Richenda said, filled with a number of actors that are really looking to address the multi-layered problems that we're talking about here of climate, of gender, and of SGB growth altogether. So I think, Andy remains another fantastic resource for this. And then, I think the other thing that I'll just say is that there's a supply and demand issue, I think. And if folks are asking from investors, from decision makers, we've seen a lot of, impact investors that we work with become more interested in engaging in efforts around gender, gender and climate, or gender in other sectors, because the SGBs and the folks that they are supporting are coming and saying, hey, we're curious about this, we're interested in this, can you point us in a direction? So I think the conversation can go both ways. And I think the more that people are asking for this kind of support and these kind of resources, the more people, decision makers and folks with funding will realize that how much interest there is in this, and that will really help kind of drive forward, additional stakeholders and additional actors who can participate and support.
Thank you. The questions are really coming in now, but Neha, would you like to add anything on this this question of where to go to, who to go to? Are there any, in terms of support for women entrepreneurs?
So not really on where to go to and who to go to, but I just wanted to highlight that there is a body of research which suggests that if women are in control of the resources, limited or more, they are able to show more ensure family health outcome, or economic stability in a family or a household. So then I think there should be something which is done to specially encourage women entrepreneurs, because there is body of research that shows that when they are in charge of a certain thing, responsible of a budget or limited resources, they come up with better outcome and better result as such. So I think they should be encouraged. So that's the short point that I want to make.
Absolutely, Neha. Even in your opening remarks, you had spoken about the inequities in power. And one of the questions that has come in from the audience is about how products may be designed for women users, but culturally in many societies, it is the men who are the decision makers when it comes to spending. And how do small and growing businesses navigate this dichotomy between who are the users, the intended users, but who are the ones who will pay? So I'm wondering, Stephanie or Richenda, would either of you like to address this question? Stephanie, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think the very first place to start is by ensuring that both parties are always in the room. And so I say that because we've had a lot of experience working with businesses that might have a customer care hotline or a customer support line or something like that. And what they'll do is they might have a product that women are actually the end users of, but when they're doing that customer outreach, they're actually reaching out to men, because the man of the household might be who paid for the product. And in that, there's a complete disconnect, because you're actually not speaking to the person who's using the product. So what we found to be really beneficial is when businesses can make an effort to make sure both parties are in the room, whether they're doing a product pitch, whether they're doing, whether they've got sort of a sales initiative they're going after, whether they're providing technical support, whatever it is, in making sure that both the man and the woman of the house are in the room is the very first place to start. From there, there's a lot. I mean, the question is very loaded, right? There's a lot to unpack under it, but I think that's the base level, and that can really begin to ensure that both parties, their needs and their preferences are being heard. And from there, you can do a lot in terms of furthering conversation to make sure that that women's voices are heard there, even if they're not the ones that are actually holding the purse strings of the household.
Richenda, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, this is a long-standing one, I mean, in the whole microfinance industry, self-help groups, these have all been set up with the idea of giving women more financial control in their household. So I think that the fundamental issue is that women should have more financial decision-making control in their households. So, and that's something I think that we can be reinforcing in our particular societies, just that equality in financial decision-making. In households. So I think that's the fundamental issue, and really, looking at reinforcing messaging in that regard. I mean, I thought Stephanie gave a great example of what you can do. I mean, I think, again, in my experience in the renewable energy industry, particularly in terms of small scale solar solutions, sometimes marketing it differently to your different customer bases can be, you get to the same place, which is that you sell the solar solution, but perhaps you just market it slightly differently when you're talking to male potential customers than you would with a woman. So, you know, on the clean cooking side, I would say this has been a challenge as well, particularly because women and children are actually the most affected by smoke from using polluting cooking technologies, particularly if it's you know, like a chula or other fires and cooking that's using wood, and that kills almost 4 million people prematurely every year. So for the woman, it may be an incentive to think about her health and her children's health. But you know, you have to really market it if it's the man who's controlling the decision making around potential cost savings. And looking actually at over time, and it may not be a capital cost, but really looking over time, which is because you tend to look at, okay, how much is it going to cost today? What do I have to put today? But really looking at cost savings over time. And I would say that that's where some of the pay-as-you-go technologies that have been really taking hold in the off-grid solar sector, and increasingly to some degree in the clean cooking sector, have been really helpful, where you don't have to sort of save for this big lump sum payment, but you can pay a smaller amount over time, which I would say is likely easier to justify in terms of your overall household spending.
Thanks. Now, the pay-as-you-go business model is really a very good example, and just an example of how we need to design innovative models of payment. And it can be done. I mean, if we can pay for Netflix as we watch, certainly we can think of ways to do that for clean energy as well. Neha, if I could turn to you, and please feel free to address this question about the payer-user dichotomy if you like, but if I could request you to also look at the next question, which is about unconscious bias. And how do you tackle unconscious bias in setting up support programs for women? For example, particularly when it comes to scouting for businesses to invest in. There are very interesting examples from the music world of blind auditions, where women musicians who were coming into audition were told not to wear high heels, so as to not even give away any sign that it was a woman musician auditioning on the other side. Is there any way in our kind of work to correct for, or to try to tackle that unconscious bias? Thanks, Neha.
Yeah, so unconscious bias, I think that's a long drawn process. Perhaps it has to do with one's learning by doing. So once we have a lot of examples, once people start taking notice of successful women entrepreneurs, this kind of bias would change. But as of now, I mean, it's a parallel thing. On one side, we move towards changing the subconscious bias that we have. But on the other side, I would like to say that we should look beyond boundaries of self-limiting perspectives and getting trapped in various gender biases. Perhaps, and I would highlight the example of India's renewable energy story. When India took this huge target of 450 gigawatt, no one actually believed that India would be able to achieve it in the given time frame. But now we see we are trying, we would perhaps overachieve the target. So I would suggest that young women entrepreneurs should be ambitious. And once you're ambitious and you are ready to believe in yourself and look beyond boundaries, then you can do away with the self-limiting biases that you have, gender biases. Then perhaps you can yourself be the agent of change and have people notice you, and that can cause a ripple effect and have other women entrepreneurs also lead your way.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it's a combination of leaning in on the part of all of us, on having a sisterhood of support, but also the systemic solutions that Richenda talked about, right? The entire ecosystem. So Richenda, I was wondering if you would also like to speak to this issue of, particularly from the perspective of financing or an investment decision, how do you correct for unconscious bias?
Yeah, I think training, first of all, is just recognizing that it exists and helping to train people around looking, as others have said, sort of looking one level below what the initial data may be telling you. That's certainly one way to do it. I would just say, sort of with bias more generally, sometimes we're also limited by our own ambitions. And if we don't have those people around us who are encouraging us to lean in and to scale and to think big, you know, then we may have our own self-limiting you know, thought processes. And again, you know, that's where I would say businesses and business leaders, as they're going through acceleration, as they're being mentored by business development supporters, you know, that's where they need to look out for those kinds of things. But on the renewable energy side, you know, despite my having started and saying, well, in the Indian context, you know, we still got a ways to go. You have some great leaders. I mean, I'm just thinking of not on the business side, but on the policy side, Gauri Singh, you know, who is now the Deputy Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency. So, you know, we've got some real assets in terms of women leaders who have been showing the way. But we still do have, I would say, unconscious bias, not only in terms of the businesses, but also where we are supported in many countries where we're working through, you know, development finance institutions. We still see, you know, sometimes, for example, if you are looking for grant funding, that the way that requests for proposals are structured, that there's still bias in there, in that they're not really gender, you know, framed, you know, to be gender responsive. And I think that is changing again, but still, you know, we have to look holistically at the whole system and be very intentional in terms of recognizing where there is bias and then actively looking and working on solutions.
Thank you. And Stephanie, if I could ask you to reflect on this question, but also add another layer to it, which is that of intersectionality. Right? We have spoken a little bit about gender today as if it's a binary thing, but there are issues of transgender people, people of color, there are issues of caste in a country like India. Would you like to just maybe address some of the things that we've spoken about, both addressing unconscious bias and the systemic solutions, but have you been challenged to look at gender as a more complex, layered issue, and how have you really thought about it and addressed it in your work?
It's a great question. Yeah, the short answer is yes. And so yes, we have been looking at that, you know, much more holistically. And when we say gender, I think even, you know, 5-6 years ago, we were speaking about men and women, and we were speaking about gender in a very binary way. And it's very different now, which is seeing that progress is really very inspiring. And I think when we think about gender, we're really thinking about sort of gender and social inclusion. So looking at a much more holistic way about because we recognize just including women in the conversation is not going to solve all of the inclusion problems. And women are not, you know, one homogenous group, right? And so and in our work, you know, we're a global organization. We have consultants that work globally. We have projects and partners that are globally seeded, which means that a topic like gender, a topic like social inclusion is incredibly nuanced. And you have to make sure that the context that you're working in is that you're really respecting the context that you're working in, as well as ensuring that you're not foregoing inclusion in one area just because it might be more challenging than you anticipated. And so I think I think the best way, it's a very large question, but I think the best way to answer it is really just thinking about really making sure that, much as we do in our business, where we start where the business is at when we speak about gender and we go from there, we really, if we're talking about inclusion more broadly, we try and start where the context is right now and then build from there. So it's, when we're working with businesses, it's really sort of letting them know it's not only about including women, but have you been considering your customers who might have disabilities? Are you considering your customers who, you know, are living in a region where you don't necessarily necessarily serve because there's possibly more conflict there. I mean, there's a million avenues to go down. And so I think it's really important just to continue to keep the conversation going when we're working with our partners, that gender is really sort of the first step that we can take. It's an entryway, because most organizations and businesses and partners that we work with have some understanding about why gender inclusion is important, even if they're not sure yet how to do it. And so gender is really the entryway for those larger conversations that are equally as important about inclusion at a broader level.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think that makes a lot of sense to think of it as gender and social inclusion. Neha, Richenda, we're reaching the end of our time. Would you like to close with maybe one sort of item on your wish list, or one piece of advice to give to the participants? Maybe a minute each for you. Richenda, would you like to go first?
I think my advice would be, don't give up. This is a very exciting space. We have a lot of work to do. Climate change is a threat, but it's also an opportunity. We need a lot of innovations. We need a lot of new solutions. So keep going, and look to support from all the great organizations I know within the Andy Network that are here to help you.
Neha?
Again, adding on to what Richenda said, don't give up, but I want to add it further, step up and be ambitious, because once we are ambitious, we want to aim higher, we definitely will reach somewhere brilliant. Yeah, that's all.
Stephanie, would you like to have the last word too?
Sure. I would just say that, don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. Just start where you are, and one step forward towards more inclusion in your business and in your work is progress. So just take that first step and don't be overwhelmed by the process.
Great. Thank you so much to all the panelists. I think you've shown us that gender and social inclusion is good business, it's good policy, and it will help us create the kind of world that we really want to live in. So thank you to Unconvention 2021 for giving us the opportunity to organize this panel. Over to you, Maithili.
Thank you so much, Ilka, and all the other panelists for sharing your expertise with the audience. Clearly, gender inclusion doesn't just matter, but it's also going to be one of the biggest drivers of social, environmental, and economic impact. Coming up next is our last session of the day, the keynote address by Carol Dahl, followed by a fireside chat between Carol and Paul Basile, the founder of Wilgrow. You definitely don't want to miss this. So see you there in 15 minutes.
Thank you. Goodbye.